Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight to our school facilities master planning sort of output of the effort that we've been working on for the last couple months. This is technically tonight a joint meeting of both our school building committee and our school committee. So we're just going to go through the process right now of opening up both of those meetings that were advertised, and then we'll get into the formal presentation. So it might feel a little bit like we're doing some weird song and dance up here, but so I think first we're going to do school committee. Chair Justin Rollo.
This is officially opening the 316 school committee meeting here at Town Hall. I see Member Tuffy, Member Horak, Member Fogarty, Member Kurzberg, and Member Donahoe are all present, including myself and the mayor. So that will open the public meeting for school committee.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Shannon Hume, and I am the chair of the Braintree School Building Committee, and I'd like to call the March 16th School Building Committee to order. The members are as follows: Mark Kurzberg as a school committee member, Mayor Aaron Joyce, Superintendent Tim McDonald, I don't have my reading glasses, sorry, Mike Esmond, Finance Director, Justin Rollo, School Committee Chair, Kristen Zaccello is a parent rep, but she's not in attendance, Emily McGinley is a community member, Sarah Kaufman, Director of Finance and Operations, Nora Vernaza, Assistant Superintendent, John Sheehan is Principal of East, not in attendance, Damon Rainey, Principal of South is not in attendance. We also have members who attend, Justin Zahn, and the new Facilities Director, and Matt Jacques, who are joined the committee, but I believe they're
I didn't introduce myself. I'm Mayor Aaron Joyce, and I'm going to be, I guess, leading this presentation, but for the majority of the presentation will be by our consultants on this effort. It was a collaboration between the town of Braintree, Braintree Public Schools, ERS, and Perkins Eastman. So ERS is an educational consultant looking at the educational side of how we deliver our services in our buildings, and Perkins Eastman is an architecture firm that helped with some of our strategy development. Real quick before we jump into the work, I want to kind of set the stage for how we got here. This has been, if you're sitting in the audience and you feel like, man, I hear this presentation every year and nothing happens. Well, yep, that's a bit accurate. We have been talking about what to do with the schools and that we should have a plan and a vision for the schools moving forward in the years ahead. And this work is really grounded on setting the stage for an informed decision for the community to make in the months ahead and probably actually years ahead. So one of the main things that this is, one of the main considerations that we have are budget challenges. Our annual funding to support school operations is limited to the revenue growth of the town. So what we've been trying to do in the last couple years is look at not only our projections for the current year, but in the years ahead. And what we've been talking about, both at the town council side of things when we're talking about our annual operating budget, but also at the school committee side, is what are we affording? Why does it feel like every year we're talking about less resources, cutting programs, not being able to afford capital investment that we need? And what we've put together here is just a reminder of what's really happening. So right now we spend about 63% of our annual town expenses in support of our schools. So that's related to school operations, benefits for our educators, debt and facility expenses. So as we look at the projection of those, what we see is we know the schools want to grow more than what we can afford. When we look at the annual town revenue that we can rely on, it's usually in the range of 2 to 3%. And what the schools need is probably closer to 4%. In the budget for the 5-year budget projections, we've been carrying 3.5% for the schools, and we've seen as soon as this year on the school budget projections that we really want to be closer to 4%. So we're always going to be kind of trying to catch up to the real need that the schools have. So, and that's just operationally. I'll show a slide later about just the, also the restrictions on the capital side. We have 2 budgets on the town. We have our operational expenses, and then we also have our capital expenses. So when we invest in buildings, we buy fire trucks, we buy police vehicles. Those are capital expenses that are outside of our annual budget. The other thing that we've been contending with is school enrollments and having, more space freed up in the buildings just because we have less students. What we had done as part of this effort last year, we had enlisted, I don't know what their technical title would be, but Cropper GRS is the company we use to look at enrollment projections. So they looked at historically housing trends in the community and then projected with zoning and changeover of housing, just, birth rates and all these different metrics. There's a lot of detail which you can certainly dive into the information we have. But I wanted to touch base on this slide because we have seen historically a decline in enrollment. And when we look at the years ahead, granted no one has a crystal ball, we're really not planning to have significantly more students than we have right now. Possibly less, but around the same amount of students that we have. So how do we plan for that? We also know that we have aging infrastructure. I think for many of you that have students in the buildings, maybe you also went to those buildings growing up, maybe your parents went to those buildings growing up. A lot of our schools have been around and been used and well loved for many, many years. And this is a snapshot of all of our buildings. So what's interesting about this is many of our elementary schools, even our high school, and in fact, the middle schools before we just renovated them, were all essentially built even before accessibility requirements became something that became best practice for construction in the mid-70s. So you can kind of see, we hear a lot of talk about a high school, that being something that the community really wants to focus on. The high school was built in 1972, so kind of middle of the road for our school construction. We have 2 new middle schools, which is a great thing. But we don't want to lose sight of the fact that all of our elementary school buildings are older than the high school. And I think this kind of shows a snapshot of why we can't just look at, say, building a new high school. We have to keep in mind that we have a lot of other aging buildings that likely aren't meeting what we know are really the needs of our students. And when you look at elementary classrooms, if you remember classrooms like they were on the left, I mean, that kind of is how I remember my elementary school. It's very different than learning today. There's breakout spaces, small learning spaces, and the need for technology and the ability to have adaptable spaces. So when we look at trying to fit modern schooling into old buildings, you can quickly see there's a lot of challenges there. And of course, we need a plan. And I think that's really what this is driving at, is getting a plan that has some vision. So if we start to make moves on buildings or we go to build a new high school, what's next? What are we doing about the elementary schools? Now, this is not a 5-year plan. This is probably more like a 20, 30-year plan. And we expect things to change. But I think it's really trying to get a direction, something to get excited about, because I think a lot of the opportunities that we'll hear about tonight are exciting options if you're coming to this with an open mind and some curiosity. It also ties back to a couple years ago when we were working on the town-wide master plan. One of the main thematic visions that we had was really having improvements in modernization to all of our town buildings, including our school buildings. So what we had broken out here is just a reminder of that. That was a task that the master plan committee directed of future leaders. And so highlighting that, it's coming at us from all angles that the community wants to see this work happen. But then how do we frame it around the funding? Because this is just a snapshot of my 5-year capital planning. This is what the town can afford to spend in the next 5 years collectively. So $35 million of capital investments town-wide. So you can see the breakdown here. About $5.4 million is dedicated to the schools. This will be, if you can hold this in your mind as a perspective when we start to talk about some of the capital needs, without really getting into like building new schools or the main just repair maintenance that we expect we need if we hold on to all of our buildings and just bring them up is about $100 million. So in 5 years, townwide, I'm spending $35 million. So it's really trying to capture the magnitude of the problem and some creative ways we might come together as a community to talk about it and think about what could be. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to ERS. Jess is going to lead us in the work that's been done. And then after that, we have on either side mics. So if you have, when it goes to the community question and answer, if you just want to line up at the mics, we can facilitate a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So thank you.
Thanks, Mayor Joyce. Great. Hi, my name is Jess O'Connor. Thanks for joining tonight. As Mayor Joyce just said, I'm going to walk us through a couple pieces of the work that we've been partnering with the town of Braintree and Braintree Public Schools over the last couple months. The first thing we're going to do is walk through the set of options that we've explored and give you a sense of what we've understood in terms of both the benefits and the trade-offs of many of these options. And you're going to see options both referencing differences in the elementary portfolio as well as different changes at the high school. We're also going to walk through a set of criteria that we've put together to help think about which types of schools make the most sense for use and closure over the next several years and how those relate to the different options. And then we'll also close with giving a little bit of the sense of the next steps here. And as Mayor Joyce said, we'll have time for questions and answers. Starting on the sort of context setting of this work, wanted to just say a couple things about the sort of goals and how we've thought about evaluating different options and scenarios against those goals. So as we kicked off this work, again, with both the town and district and our partners at Perkins Eastman, there were three main goals or sort of ideas that we were trying to balance across these. The first is, how do we maximize the experiences for our students and educators in schools? This is work that ERS, Education Resource Strategies, the organization that I work for, we study what it means to align resources to improve student experiences. And so that's one of the lenses that we bring to understanding how the facilities and the makeup of schools actually implicates how students and educators experience their day-to-day and ultimately the quality of the instruction. We also want to balance and maximize what families experience, both in terms of the sort of short-term changes as well as the longer-term sort of experience of being in Braintree, experiencing the sort of facilities and spaces as a resident, as a community member. And then we need to balance that, of course, across both the short-term and long-term cost implications. So thinking not only about the cost to invest, but also what that might mean for the long-term sort of affordability for residents in the community. So as we talk through each of the options, you're going to see ways that we tried to measure and assess how each of the ways that you could organize and could think differently about your set of schools and the ways that they're organized actually sit sort of are assessed across these categories. Just a couple things about process here. If you've been following along to some of the updates that we've been sharing along the way, you'll know, we started this process really with a deep dive of data and facilities data collection. You'll see posters in the back that highlight some of the dashboard development work that's happened as part of this phase to bring just even more data and transparency into what the buildings and the facility footprint in Braintree looks like right now. We then moved into a scenario development phase where we looked really deeply at a wide range of scenarios against what I shared before as some of those goals and visioning criteria. And then that led us to where we are today, where we have a chance to really share some of that work that we've been doing. I also wanted to highlight that this work has been informed and collaborated with this working group, including many members of both the school and the district side. And this is really meant to be an opportunity to share what we've learned, not as a sort of decision-making moment, but really as a continued information sharing and then ultimately input gathering moment as well. So you'll see at the end of this, we are going to ask for folks to give us feedback via a survey or to come up and share both comments and questions at the end. So then getting into the options, there are four categories of options that we explored specifically around the elementary sites that we think are worth sort of further consideration. So I'm going to define each of these, then we're going to go deeper into each of these four. But just to start with a little bit of definition setting about what these options look like. So the first option that we looked at was what it would mean to preserve the existing portfolio. So investing to maintain all of your existing schools, both across elementary, middle, and high. And you can see what that would look like is keeping your current set of 6 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and your current high school. And we'll talk a little bit about what we see as some of the benefits and sort of trade-offs to that. The second is optimizing, what we're calling optimizing within existing capacity. So Mayor Joyce mentioned the facilities you have now exceed the enrollment that you need that space for now and in the future. And so this would mean maintaining only the number of sites that you need for that current and future enrollment. Based on our analysis, we think that likely means having 5 elementary sites instead of 6, 2 middle school sites, and 1 high school. So we're going to explore that option a little bit in detail as well. The third is reconfiguring both the grade band, so the number of grades in schools, and changing the sort of access and space. And so what that would look like is changing how many grades are served in buildings and also leveraging some of the space that exists in buildings outside of your elementary footprint. So you'll see on the right there, this is probably the one that changes the most things that you're gonna see. This could look like having a reconfigured lower and upper elementary footprint, where you have lower K-2 schools, upper elementary, and then a co-located sort of junior and upper high school campus. So we'll talk more about that one. And then the last category of options we explored was what it would look like to create fewer larger schools. For those of you familiar with the sites themselves, many of Braintree's facilities are square footage-wise smaller. So these are not large campuses necessarily with few students, they are smaller campuses with smaller students in it. And so this would mean expanding on existing sites or potentially building new, but for the purposes of the assessment, this looked like expanding on existing sites so that you could operate at 3 or 4, I think anything below that we didn't really explore as a viability, 3 or 4 elementary sites, 2 middle school sites, and 1 high school. I'm going to walk through each of these in more detail. I will also name, there were different options or sort of permutations that we looked at within each of these categories, but these sort of describe the sort of comprehensive set of options that we think are viable ones for the community to explore. So before we get too deep into what each of these are and the sort of benefits and trade-offs that we see, just wanted to pause a little bit on this idea of school size. So this is something that our organization studies a lot when we look at schools across the country. There are ways that the size of a school, the number of students in a school, actually implicate how students and educators and family members experience those schools and some of the dynamics. And so just to give both what we see, sort of on a national lens, but also many of the experiences that are true in Braintree. Smaller schools, and there's no perfect number here. We said the range, is typically between 200 and 400 students is what we would consider a smaller school. Some of the experiences of students and families in that school are often a sense of community. These are often schools where families, there are fewer families to get to know. School staff may also have fewer families that they're getting to know, and so there's this more natural and organic sense of community. They're sometimes in more geographically tighter areas, so these may be schools, that are more neighborhood-based. And that is a huge benefit for many in terms of the experience of a smaller school. It also comes at the sort of trade-off of often more constrained resources. This is something that's not always obvious to families and community members who don't sort of live in schools day to day. But smaller schools often operate with more part-time or shared staff. They have, particularly at the secondary level, you tend to see fewer program offerings. I think something we've seen as a bright spot in Braintree is that at the elementary level, there's actually been a strong investment in keeping that breadth of specials programming available at schools, but that is something that we often see is lower sort of breadth of program offerings in smaller schools. You often have smaller teacher teams, and that matters for things like collaboration, sharing the workload, being able to collaborate with your peers. So if you have only 1 or 2 homerooms per grade, that can complicate it. And then the last is that these are often higher cost to operate to the town and district, both in terms of the facilities and the actual physical space, but also the sort of staffing and operations. Larger schools sort of have a flip side in terms of its benefits and trade-offs. It can be harder to sort of structure and create that sort of sense of community in many larger schools. Doesn't mean it cannot be done, but it often requires more intentional structures. It also means that there are typically more scaled supports and resources. So more time and more specialized roles, more opportunities for teachers to collaborate with one another, and more opportunities for students to be grouped flexibly across a grade or across multiple grades. That's something that we see increasingly important for implementing some of the research-based strategies around early literacy, being able to group students. And so that's an important experience that is easier and more conducive in larger schools. So as we walk through each of the options, you're going to hear me talk about how different options implicate some of these experiences, and these are many of those experiences that we're trying to reflect as both benefits and trade-offs of different options. Okay, so I'm going to get into the first option in more detail. You're going to see 4 versions of this, just so you have a sense of where we're going. The first one I wanted to share was preserving your existing portfolio. So again, making no changes to the number of schools. We're looking at those 3 categories of impacts that I shared at the beginning: the impact on student and educator experiences, impact on family and community, and impact on fiscal sustainability. So what you can see in this is, by making no changes to that portfolio, you also are not making any changes in terms of the current challenges in organization of schools. So what I just mentioned about some sort of more challenging teacher collaboration, harder to group students, that is true in your existing portfolio now, and this would not impact that, would not change or improve that. On the family and community, we know that the disruption to families is something that people care a lot about, and so this does preserve both the existing portfolio and sort of that neighborhood school status that we've heard a lot in our conversations, and avoids student reassignment. Also means that without other big investments in your spaces, that few students are going to experience meaningfully different upgraded spaces, particularly in the short term. And then lastly, on the fiscal sustainability, you're going to see some categories of this repeat, but there are efficiencies, as we just were talking about with the larger schools, that you can realize in larger schools that this would not realize. So you would not have any of those larger school sort of operational efficiencies. It also requires the most amount of dollars for what Mayor Joyce was referring to as sort of the capital improvements, deferred maintenance, all the costs just to operate schools that are safe and viable for operation. By not reducing any of your footprint, you will spend the most amount in those sorts of costs of any of these options. The second option we'll talk through is that optimization. So again, thinking about how you can reduce the number of sites that you operate so that it better matches your existing and future enrollment. You will see a small improvement in some of those student and educator experiences as you get slightly larger grade sizes. You will also be able to move students into the buildings that do have some improved conditions, and with some targeted investments be able to serve more students in facilities that are in better condition than they are today. And do so in a way, in this scenario in particular, that doesn't require significant redistricting beyond the school that would be affected by the closure. It also doesn't require expansions. Now, that's depending on the school site you select, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. You get some efficiencies from both an operational standpoint and staffing, and it does reduce the capital costs that you would have to invest in by having fewer schools. All right, 2 more to walk through, and then we'll talk a little bit about sort of a step back assessment here. So the third option that I mentioned was reconfiguring, so changing the number of grades that are served in every school. This would allow you to have fewer lower elementary sites, so 3 lower elementary sites, 2 upper elementary sites, and as I mentioned, that co-located junior and high school. This has big impact in terms of grade size and school, and so grade size, not school size, in fact. But that grade size actually does create a lot of that efficiencies that I mentioned in terms of collaboration and being able to flexibly group students, and so that's a more significant improvement in this. We also recognize this has probably the most disruption of any of the scenarios that we looked at in terms of family assignment, both in terms of moving students across schools and reconfiguring the grades. And a longer timeline as you think about how you would roll out a reconfiguration that tends to be a much longer process because it needs to be done thoughtfully, and so you're not going to realize those as shortly. In the end, this option does the most to maximize students' access to the most improved spaces. And so in many ways, this is sort of one of your bigger bets on the facility access that you could consider. It also creates more of those operational efficiencies that we talked about. And in terms of the elementary cost, we're going to talk about high school in a little bit, but just as a preview here, in terms of the elementary cost, this would also have the lowest cost of necessary improvements in your elementary buildings because you'd be reducing the number of sites that you're continuing to invest in. It is dependent, however, on being able to invest in a high school renovation or reconstruction that allows for the co-location of additional grades in that sort of junior high, and depending on how you might want to organize that, could incur additional costs to sort of create different campuses, separate. So want to be clear about that, but in terms of the elementary impact is one of the lowest cost. And then the last option that we explored, again, was the creating fewer and more upgraded school campuses. This could look like, I mentioned we did a couple different options here. So in some options, we looked at what it would look like for 3 schools, 3 elementary, some for 4. And the impact in terms of some of these experiences is marginal, and so we're grouping them together just to name a couple of those. So similar to the option 3 in terms of reconfiguring, you are going to realize some of those same experiences in terms of larger grade size and larger schools, affording some of those experiences around more full-time staff, more potential for collaboration and student supports. Again, this is a bigger disruption. This would require not only probably reassignment of schools, but some rezoning, redistricting, and additional location. And again, one of the goals here would certainly be positioning schools to have more investments and more upgrades and fewer sites, and so more students end up in better conditioned facilities than they are today. And then you can see, I won't read this last one here. Similar to the other options, it does create some of those operational efficiencies, and it also reduces some of the capital investment. The big difference with this option is it would require additions and expansions to your existing sites, because as I mentioned, that your existing footprints aren't that large, and so you will see a higher short-term cost to invest in some of those expansions. So we do have a handout that we can share with folks that shares this, since I just walked through a lot of information, and you certainly can't read what's on here now. But wanted to just say a couple things as you look across these options. In our assessment, and talking with Perkins Eastman, who again is our partner architecture firm in this, as we think about which options best maximize some of those experiences and best mitigate some of your sort of short-term trade-offs and opportunities, the second and third option we think has the most viability. Now, ultimately, as a outside consultant and counsel, we can't tell you which option is best, and this is not the moment to sort of make that decision for you all. But what we can tell you is that as we look across some of these criteria and some of the assessment, those would be ones that we think would really warrant additional consideration and thought as opportunities to really maximize, if you think about this a little bit as a sort of ROI, return on investment type of exercise. These 2 options we think really can sort of maximize some of those opportunities. So wanted to share a little bit about that. I'm going to move to talk a little bit about the high school, and then we're going to come back to show a little bit more about cost, since I'm sure that's something that is top of mind for folks. But wanted to share first that we also, in parallel to these elementary options, also explore different options to update and renovate Braintree High. As Mayor Joyce alluded to, we've heard this as a big topic of consideration in many previous conversations in some of the surveys and focus groups that we did. And so wanted to both show what that could look like. Our partners, Perkins Eastman, as part of this effort, went through to do some high-level feasibility testing on the options, and their assessment is, as you look across these, any of these options are viable. And so if you're sitting wondering, is it possible to renovate on the existing site of Braintree High? The answer is, pending any deep feasibility assessment, it is a viable option. And so that's why we wanted to show sort of what that range could look like in terms of how you all may choose to want to, in the short term and long term, invest in Braintree High School. So the first would be sort of your In some ways, your status quo do nothing option, which is addressing only the capital sort of renewal costs. So those are, again, those maintenance costs. Some of them will have cosmetic upgrades as part of that, but this is really just about maintaining Braintree High as a functional and operational site. And you'll see a little bit about how we've tried to characterize how these are implicated with some of the elementary options. In some ways, you can think about this decision in parallel, and in some cases, these are sort of dependent decisions. But continuing to go through, then you could choose to invest in that sort of deferred maintenance and prioritize some more targeted renovation spaces. We've heard a lot about, the science labs wanting to get updated to more modern standards, or investing in some additional art spaces, creating a sort of long-term home for the pre-K. So that's another option as far as how you might want to think about the modernization of the high school, all the way to a full-scale renovation and new construction. And we'll share a little bit about sort of high-level cost ranges here. The one thing I would note in terms of this implication that I highlighted earlier is, in most cases, any of these options can work in parallel to the decision that you may make on the elementary side. The one dependency is if you did want to co-locate additional grades, then you would likely need to invest more in both the upgrade and sort of reconfiguration of that site. So with that, I'm going to share a little bit about cost magnitude here, both in the elementary options and in the high school options. So what we've tried to do is put together a little bit of a cost heat map just to give you a sense of magnitude here. On the left, you're going to see each of those elementary options that I just walked us through and the sort of cost ranges. And you can see the sort of low and high range here is between $50 and $100 million for each of those options. That includes, again, things like addressing all of those deferred maintenance costs, the cost of any expansions and upgrades that are included. At the top, you're going to see the higher magnitude cost ranges here, and that's your high school options. So you can see everything from, again, the sort of capital and deferred maintenance, that capital renewal, all the way to a brand new construction of your existing footprint high school. And you're going to see that magnitude here. So just to kind of put these together in context, I'll walk through just a couple examples here. So if the community decided that they wanted to preserve the existing portfolio, make no changes to the elementary footprint, and do only the capital renewal needs at the high school, together that's about $135 million. Folks have asked before in previous conversations, like, if we do make no changes, are we still going to have to do a debt exclusion or invest significantly in our schools? And the answer is yes. And that's sort of the data point that we would put in front of you for that. Again, just to give you another data point, the option that I was mentioning around reconfiguration being paired with a more substantial renovate to the high school could be around $450 million. And then the last one is sort of your high watermark here. If you chose to invest in creating those newer and fewer schools and upgraded, and chose to do a full new construction of the same capacity, that's about $700 million. And these are high cost ranges. Our partners at Perkins Eastman help develop these based on construction costs and other data points for schools in the area that have gone through similar changes, but are meant to really just be a scale of magnitude here. The other thing I would flag is these are total cost numbers, and so they don't reflect many of the things that, as you get into more of the operationalizing of any of these changes, any partnerships with MSBA, which is the Massachusetts School Building Authority. They provide subsidies for new construction and repairs, any grants that you may have available. And so these are sort of the total cost. Again, was premature in this moment to say exactly what these costs are going to mean for families and residents, because we don't have a decision or a choice yet. But we did want to just give a little bit more for folks who are sort of sitting and wondering, what would those cost ranges mean to me as a resident and as a taxpayer? So wanted to just share a couple of the variables that play into that. So obviously the total cost of the project is one of those big variables. I mentioned the MSBA and other subsidies that may sort of defray that final cost. The financing terms of any loan are going to implicate that. Obviously your residential and commercial base, And all of that will then implicate what the sort of per year property tax implication. So I thought it helpful to give an example for folks who have not been deep in this process before. You all, in the last couple years, went through a debt exclusion and construction project for South Middle School. So to walk through a little bit of how those numbers played out and would have implicated the tax implication, that full project was around $80 million. The partnership with MSBA subsidized that at around 37%. And so that the project cost that Braintree was responsible for was closer to 50 million, not that total 80. So you can see that significant difference there. The financing terms were quite favorable in 2019 at that interest rate. And so you'll see both the loan term, the years, and then what that means for just the annual debt service, in that case being around 2.7 million. You then divide that by both your commercial and your residence, and you get to, on average, around 150 a year on average. Obviously, that depends on home values, that depends on the tax rates, but that, just to give you all a sense of that magnitude for one project, those same variables would come into play for any of the decisions and options that we're talking about. Okay. I know I threw a lot at you with these options. I'm going to share a little bit about the school criteria, and then we will get into some next steps and get you all into some Q&A. So I mentioned to inform this question about which sites in any option. You know, at the end of the day, the answer is you can choose any sites. They will have different implications in terms of cost and in terms of the impact on both students' assignment and redistricting. So what we tried to do to help inform that decision is look at all of the existing elementary sites available and sort of look at them across 4 criteria. And there's actually some sub-criteria within these that we'd be happy to share. But the first sort of major criteria was enrollment. This can be a bit of a misnomer because enrollment is not a site variable. You can enroll more or fewer students up to the capacity of that building. The reason enrollment matters in terms of assessing the sort of future use and any closure options is because it will impact, 1, the number of students implicated to be reassigned, but 2, it can also impact whether or not the system would have to do additional reassignments and sort of redistricting to balance the impact of any one site being sort of closed, and potentially additional expansions at existing sites. So that's why enrollment matters. It is not a site criteria, but it does implicate how you would think about choosing any one site over another. And so you're going to see that. Building capacity and condition is a little bit more obvious. We want to understand sort of what schools can accommodate in terms of students, in terms of the classrooms. Not every school of the same square footage has the same number of classrooms, the same number of community spaces. There's some schools that have separate gyms and cafeterias. Sometimes they're combined. And so we want to look at that to understand what the capacity is in its current state. Condition obviously matters a lot too. You'll see, especially if you look at the facilities dashboard, we go really deep on what the different condition factors are, but that's everything from the maintenance needs that we've talked a lot about, ADA accessibility. There is a survey that our partners at Perkins Eastman did called an educational adequacy assessment that also measures sort of the condition for the building to support educational programming needs, and so that's another factor that we'll look at. And then the last factor that we looked at is location. Both in terms of proximity to other schools, but also in terms of where the physical site is, you know, relative to other parts of the town, its sort of centrality to the district. So I'm going to show a heat map in a second of each of the schools. There's going to be a lot of data on this. I will walk through it, and I will pause if folks want to take a closer look. But what you see in here is, again, every elementary school currently in operation and the former middle school Old South building, which is currently not in use, but we are looking at it from the lens of how it could be used as an elementary site, given that it is currently unoccupied. And what we've done is we've sort of rank ordered each of them on those 4 criteria. There is no perfect science to the heat map here, but this was intended to give you an illustration of how to think about individually each of these criteria and how they sort of come together to give us a sense of which sites, again, would make more sense or make less sense to keep open or close. So just to walk through a couple of these, I won't walk through line by line. But you can see, for example, as we go across the first line, for Ross Elementary School, there's sort of three categories again. The enrollment category here, Ross is currently the smallest enrolled site. So they're the fewest number of students in that site, again, from the perspective of how you would have to reassign and redistrict. That is a more favorable criteria. In terms of capacity, it is one of the smallest sites, and there's also more shared spaces in that building than relative to other campuses. And then as far as condition, I think one of the things you'll see if you were deep in some of the maintenance and condition data is there is not a huge range in terms of the facility conditions across elementary schools. There's actually more similarities in terms of the condition than differences. So you're going to see a lot that sort of sit in this middle, like not on either end of a spectrum. And that's true for Ross as well. And so that's why you'll see, I hope the color coding is working on this screen, but you'll see the slightly more red and slightly more yellow. And then the location we didn't give as a sort of color coding here, in part because it depends on which options you're choosing and how that would impact this idea of sort of location and impact. I'm going to give you a second just to scan through here. Again, we added Old South here, and you can see obviously the enrollment is not applicable. It's not currently being leveraged as a site. It is the largest, if you considered it an elementary site, it would be the largest elementary site available to the district. And also, as far as sort of the condition, has many of the same upgrade needs as other campuses, but as far as some of the more high priority and costly investments, it's sort of in the average to lower average there. So again, we can help bring data to this question. This is ultimately a community-based decision. And so I will share a little bit about how you could think about applying these ratings to those scenarios. Ultimately, we are not recommending any specific site closures, but hoping that this helps to elevate sort of the options and trade-offs of any decision that you all could choose to make. So what would applying these ratings and sort of rankings of schools to the options look like? I'll walk through just two of them, the two that we talk through in terms of optimization and reconfiguration. So that in that scenario, if you were to apply those ratings to this decision or to this option of 5 elementary sites, that would likely look like in the east operating Flaherty, Morrison, and Hollis and closing Ross. It would also look like in the site using Old South as an elementary site, Liberty, and closing Highlands. Again, just to put the numbers together with these options. The third one here, you can see again, similarly, it would look like reducing the east footprint to Morrison Hollis. In that instance, you'd be closing Ross and Flaherty. And in the south, this would actually look like having Old South as the singular lower elementary building and closing Liberty and Highlands. Again, just to reemphasize here, this does not mean you cannot choose other school sites, and there may be good reasons to do so. Every community will have different reasons and criteria that sit outside of those 4 that I mentioned. There are different impacts of choosing different sites, and that's really the thing we want folks to have a sense of, is if you chose, for example, a different East school, it would likely mean additional reassignment and redistricting, and potentially some small additions, whether that's a modular or a full-scale addition. Similar in the example, and we know Hollis has been brought up in conversations before about both its size, but also its age. Mayor Joyce showed that in the beginning as one of the sort of older buildings. There are a lot of maintenance costs at Hollis. You could choose to keep Hollis as one of your sites, and I think there's lots of reasons to do that. You could choose to close Hollis, and there might be good reasons to do that. It, again, would require additional enrollment redistricting and rebalancing and likely additional sites. So I'm going to close. I do see a hand raised. Do you want to go to timeline first, just to close this out, and then we can start Q&A, if that's okay with you all? Okay. Okay. Great. Then I'm going to pass it back. Thank you for listening to that, and excited to get into Q&A. But I'm going to pass it back to you to just do a little bit of timeline.
Thank you. Thanks, Jess.
Yeah.
So the timeline is high level, and I think meant to kind of give a sense for how fast we can and probably can't move on some of these things. And I also wanted to remind folks that we are still continuing as a community to put forward a statement of interest to the MSBA for a high school. That has been something that the community is trying to accomplish for several years. So we don't want to lose sight of the fact that that was recently approved at the school committee to go before the town council in the next couple of weeks to be put forward to the MSBA. Now, we don't know if we'll be accepted in for a new high school. Officially, you submit your statement of interest. If the MSBA selects you for partnership, you would move into the next phase, which is the feasibility study. And if you remember, back when we were doing the debt exclusion for the South Middle School, we also did ask the community for money to go towards a feasibility study. So right now we do have the ability to fund a feasibility study for the high school. So that's good news. And I think we want to, at the same time that we're thinking about what we might do at the elementary school level, keep track of the momentum on a potential high school project. So that's highlighted on the top left. So we're kicking off the community input on these ideas. At the same time, we are talking amongst, we'll be before the town council, looking forward to submitting an SOI for the high school. And I think in the next couple weeks, depending on what questions come out of tonight, what sort of momentum, if any, through behind any of these scenarios, start talking about what options might be shaking out as preferred options, what options we might start working towards. A lot of that discussion will be held at the school committee in the weeks and months ahead, so highlighting that. We're the school committee, to move in a direction of options 2, 3, or 4, where we might try to work towards a potential reduction of the elementary school sites. We believe the earliest students could potentially move. That would be likely a move, for example, like if Highlands were to close and Old South were to open. That would likely be the earliest time that could happen, would be for next school year. That wouldn't involve a big redistricting because that would be a shift of the Highlands community to Old South. So probably more robust redistricting and redistribution would happen in the following school year at the earliest. And again, these are kind of meant to give you a sense for how quickly this will go and probably also how slowly it will go. And I think as we look ahead, pending acceptance into the MSBA project, we would hear in December of this year if we were accepted in, and then that would roll into a feasibility study. It's kind of hard to predict how long that would take for us, and we would certainly need to be gearing up in all of these options for additional resources. We cannot afford to build a new high school and really to make the repairs that are needed on all of our elementary schools without debt exclusion votes, whether that's for a new school building or for debt exclusions. And we have used them in the past for repairing roofs. We do not have, within the current town resources, the ability to tackle a lot of these. So raising community awareness to this, not only if you have students in the schools, but as we look to the community for more resources through a debt exclusion, that affects everyone, folks that have kids in the schools, people who don't. So it really is a community-based discussion and something to be mindful of. So I wanted to outline this timeline, but again, just from a big picture perspective of when potentially the earliest students could move and where the discussion will be more robustly taking place after this meeting. So I do want to kick it off into questions and answers. We do have a survey for tonight, is that right? So please feel free to take the survey. And we have 2 mics on either side, so if you have a question, you can just kind of come on up and form a line and ask questions. This is being televised and live streamed, so if you have a question and want to come up, now's the time.
Hi, I'm Sarah DeMeo. I live in Braintree. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I've learned a lot. I really am excited to dive into it later on and look at it carefully. I feel really good as a Braintree Public Schools mom. My oldest graduated from Braintree High last year. I have a middle one, and my youngest one is in 3rd grade, so I've been listening to this information for a long time and will be doing it for many, many more years. So this is really good to know. My thanks to the mayor's office and the school administration, school committee, our business partners. Thank you for, it's good to know that we as community members can have informed decision-making right now. My comment and I guess request for clarification was the timing coming off of the last slide. If we could talk about that just a little bit more, because I think when we're talking about all of the options, to me, everything does kind of start with what do we want to do about the high school, and would we partner with the state for a rebuild or a major renovation, or do something smaller. And my understanding was that if we were to partner with the state and do something big, that would be a debt exclusion, but we may be many, many years away from that. And so I think it would be helpful for community members to know if we have our oldest child, let's say in 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade, if they're 10 years away from that, maybe the option we propose to the town is we do something smaller and renovate the high school. So to me, the when is so important, because that's, everything cascades from that, whether it's a debt exclusion, it affects everybody in the community, but also which families are you talking to? Is it the parents of 8th graders, 3rd graders, people who want to move into town and start a family? When will this affect them? And I think that would just be really helpful to have a clearer sense of that. Thank you.
To ask, were we to be invited in as early as early next year, you could expect a high school project to probably take somewhere from beginning to completion, maybe 5 to 7 years. You're probably maybe 2, 3 into going for a debt exclusion for a project like that. I think we absolutely need to partner with the MSBA on the high school, and I think we won't know if, when we do the feasibility study for the high school, they will explore whether or not we should renovate, whether or not we should build new. I think, some of the the feasibility of opening it up for a grade span, if that's, something we want to incorporate into the feasibility study, we'll be able to have that discussion. So I think when you partner with the MSBA, it's not just on a new building. It could be a smaller project. I think we have to take into consideration what the affordability for the community is. But all that would be through that feasibility study once accepted into the process.
Okay. I think that's great to know, because I think parents or community members might be more open to different ideas if they feel like, well, if we do something smaller, but it can happen sooner, that's a better option for us. Or not, versus the whole enchilada a decade from now. All right,
Great,
thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ken Belcher. I went K through 12 to the schools, as did my wife, our children, and our parents. We've been here a long time. We have great affinity for the schools. Kudos that Sarah just shared. I share the same kudos. I have a question from an educational point of view. If we took money and separated the money completely, so took the finances, just stepped the finances aside, which I know we can't do, but for a moment we did that, and took the neighborhoods and stepped those aside for a moment and just focused on the students and the educators. Is there research that indicates what the right size and what the right grouping should be of our students in the classrooms? I mean, what I'm asking is, one of them has K through 2, another one has another grouping. The traditional groupings we all understand, but I'm wondering from an educational point of view, just looking at the students and the educators, have we found that one particular model of groupings works better, that the education for the students and the educators themselves giving that education works best?
I think that we do a lot of studying on this question, both in terms of the size and the organization. I think the short answer from what we see across the country is there is no one model. There's great schools that produce great outcomes for kids that are everything from a K-12 to a K-2. Some of the conditions for strong teaching and learning include things like access to collaboration, ability to group, and so those are some of the things we tried to pull out here, but I think you will not find a research study that says that one configurations of schools is by and large better than another, because there's also a lot of other factors that go into it, but there are common sort of research-backed conditions that we can look at, and that was part of our process in examining
Are you
that.
finding a best practices model that many towns are going to now with a large high school or small elementary schools or 3 or 4 middle schools? Is there a model that seems to be a best practices model that is starting to surface right now?
There's not a common model even in Massachusetts, and certainly if you look outside of Massachusetts, I think you'll find there's a lot of different configurations. What I would reiterate is I think something that we consistently see in schools that are very small, again, that sort of under 300, is some of those experiences are harder to make happen or cost more to make happen.
Yeah.
And I think that's as close as we can get
Less
to sort of
collaboration,
a
less
fact
sharing
base.
information? Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it.
But from our research and what we see out there, there's no definitive sort of structure that works. And I'm sure the school committee and principals in this community would also say that they have beliefs about what works in terms of the configuration, but from a evidence base, there isn't a clear answer there.
I can see the school committee ready to jump out of their chairs. Rachel, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Michelle. I am a Braintree resident, and I have 2 children in elementary school. So just a couple things that were concerning to me, just that were kind of not discussed, which maybe they will be at a later date. I think we had discussed towards the end of this situation last year was concerns from some parents of if a building is closed, what's the future of that building, which I know Mayor Joyce had mentioned that that's not really this, that's not the school committee's situation anymore. Once it's turned over, it's turned over. But I think that would go a long way in helping with acceptance of a plan if we had an idea of what might potentially happen with those buildings, because in history in Braintree, a lot of schools have been closed, and sometimes the buildings sit for a really long time, and that affects the property value for the people who have bought homes in the surrounding area. And then I was also concerned, if we are going to do another debt exclusion at some point, that's going to be more money out of our pockets, which in the long run is probably going to be a good investment. But also, like for a school like Ross, it seems that they'll be divided up between possibly a couple of schools, and those would all be schools that we would then be asked to bus to and be asked to pay money for buses that we never had to have come out of our pockets in the past. So I just think that's something to take into consideration too. I don't know if there's a way to figure out, at least for a year or two, some type of lowered cost for that, just because that's something that we had not planned on having to have come out of our budget. And then, no, I think that was it, actually. Thank you.
Good evening. How are you? Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and thank you, Mayor Joyce, for holding this forum for the people of Braintree. This isn't limited to just parents of school children. This affects every single person, every taxpayer in our community. I don't have any children in the school, but to me, our school system is a #1 priority for our community, but for the future as well. So I applaud the effort that's being put in here tonight and what has been underway for a number of years to try to fix these problems that we have. I think we all know that revenue is a huge challenge for not just the community, but for all communities across the state. As a student in the Braintree school system, I had the advantage of a robust partnership with the federal government and the state government when our tax dollars went to Washington, went to Boston, and they came back to us in the form of good schools and good infrastructure. We don't have that anymore. So here we are with a problem, and like any responsible adult, we have to face our problems. I have many questions, but I know we're limited to one this go-around. So I guess to talk a little bit, I want to lead up to what the question is. So there were a number of considerations that the consultants and the town had undertaken when they approached this challenge for this iteration. I know we went through this last year. There's been some data collection that's been utilized from last year's studies as well. And, you know, from my perspective, the number one priority is the education. What's the education? Are we doing the best we can to educate the children? Secondly, the consideration is, are we doing the best we can to create an atmosphere, an environment where our children are going to receive the best education that they can, and that our teachers are going to have the equipment that they need and the adequate facilities to provide that education, and that our parents of these children are assured that their children are in a safe place, an environmentally comfortable place for them to learn. So, that being said, I mean, the elementary schools are our largest challenge, and I think rightfully so, that should be their priority. There was some consideration that the consultant had given in terms of the approach to the heat map of the elementary schools, in that 1 was enrollment, 2 was improvements needed, 3 was physical condition, and 4 was location. I agree that location does not belong on the top. Location is not something that we as a community need to prioritize, because that takes away, I believe, from the effort and the money that we could use for the education of our children and the facilities, the learning environment that these children are going to be in. So I'd ask you, as you and the town together go down this road, to try to find solutions, which, you know, we can talk about excuses, we can talk about things that have happened in the past, but what I'm very happy to see is that the administration and the town as a whole, the school committee, are taking this head on. This is where we are. This is the stake in the ground that we have to establish, and we need to move forward. We don't have a whole lot of money, so what are our priorities? I stick by the first 2 priorities that I stated. I think that should direct this effort. I think location, again, when you think about the education and the facility within the environment that a student is going to learn, whether or not that student is going to be taught in East Braintree, the Highlands, Central Braintree, South Braintree, that's insignificant to the education itself. So I would ask that, you know, in terms of centrally located as a reason for a school to get a higher mark, I say strike that from the considerations. It's not really serving the student's education. My question is, you had also made mention of the fact, so sorry about taking a long way to get to my question, but my question is, has there been some consideration in grading done for which elementary schools would be expanded upon? What is the criteria that you undertook? Was it physical space of the acreage? Was it physical space of the building? Was it structural integrity of the building? Was it the age of the building? Was it the infrastructure, the heating systems, et cetera? I'd like to know a little bit more about that, and I will yield. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, happy to answer a little bit more about how we thought about the expansion criteria. So I mentioned our partners at Perkins Eastman. They do deep feasibility studies like what you do as part of the MSBA. This was not a deep feasibility study of options, but they do have factors they look at when they think about what makes a site more or less viable for expansion. So some of the things that you just mentioned in terms of just like physical square footage of the site, the infrastructure, I think that was more about sort of the thinking about how much you would need to invest in a building in order to bring it up. Sometimes people call that like a facility condition index. So how much do you have to invest in order to bring that building up? And so that's a consideration too. If something costs a lot even just to invest given the square footage, then it's often not as preferred as the site. What they did not do is any deep like site structural analyses. That happens as part of any like deeper facilities feasibility study, but they did sort of visual and like walk-through observations just to understand high-level feasibility. And then in terms of some of those cost estimates, those were mostly done as a industry average based on what they see in Massachusetts as typical construction costs. So those were not any deeper than square footage.
Okay, so
costs.
it's preliminary.
Very preliminary.
All right, so there is no extensive. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that answer.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm sure that you guys are going to put education first, so I don't even have any questions about that. There was a comment about the town having $35 million for capital investments over the next 5 years. Is that the right number?
That is the right number. Yep.
And that the shortfalls that the town's facing for capital for the schools is $100 million?
Yes.
And with all these options, where I see the spreadsheets and everything, is there a breakdown on what that $100 million is and where that changes based on the options that you guys have presented?
Yeah, so the $100 million was originally, it had been discussed in years past when we were looking at a backlog of work at each school. So if you, as part of this effort, we had created a dashboard for each school. So if you went to like the Hollis School dashboard, you could see where the monies are allocated for like bringing it up to like what we would expect it to be. Were we keeping up with maintenance and repairs all along? So the 100 million was roughly 50 million at the high school and 50 million spread out amongst the elementary schools as the capital need to kind of get the schools in a facilities condition that would be, where we would want them to be for the schools to be operational.
And is it going to be just made very clear to the town what that $50 million is for and what our options are based on what schools stay open or get moved, et cetera? And then I also remember something about, when we put the roofs on the other buildings, when we're not using them, we may have to owe that money back. I just think it's very important to explain to the town what this money is for, where it's going, why, and the benefits to not just closing schools, but where that real money is allocated.
Yeah, so we also added to the facilities dashboard for each of the schools any potential MSBA money that we've already sort of borrowed and could owe back. So as you look at each individual school, you can see what repair we expect that amount of money to cost. Are there any outstanding MSBA sort of borrowed monies that we might have to pay back? So that's on the dashboard, so we can start to weigh some of these options as we look at the 50 million for like repairs at the elementary schools. The sort of chart that breaks that down is sort of per school, per like HVAC, plumbing. So we do have a chart that kind of shows where we would anticipate that money to be spent. It's not in enough detail to say be ready for a project or to be ready to ask the community for money to spend on a project. We still have to create, identify the project, identify the scope of the project, bid it, get the money. So there's a lot of work to do before we could have the money to do the project, but just real big picture, we're trying to capture the order of magnitude so folks can, start to make informed decisions about where they might want to see their tax dollars spent.
Good luck, you're going to need it.
Thanks for the questions. Yes.
Hi, my name's Karsten Olinik. I have a fourth grader at Ross. And honestly, I think I'm having a little bit of a flashback here because it's been, pretty much a year. And a year ago, we talked about closing Ross, keeping Hollis open, the oldest and way more structurally unsound, I would say, school, and closing Highlands and putting them in Old South. There has been, apart from the usual, I don't want my kids to go there or here, there has been real problems with that plan. For one, Ross is a Title I school. Old South is so close to New South that if you put one of the biggest elementary schools into Old South on top of the traffic in New South through neighborhood streets, that seems like a bad idea. So has that been a factor in your evaluation of these different scenarios? Because that seems very important. Yeah.
I would say in response to that, one of the biggest sort of outcries that I felt like I heard during the last conversation a year ago, we were making decisions to try to use resources more efficiently, to potentially save on some operational costs. But we didn't have a what's next. We know we were going to make those changes, but that wouldn't mean our operational budget was going to be, good to go the following year. So we didn't want to be in a position where we didn't have a what's next. We didn't have a plan. We didn't want to bring forward a high school and be like, oh, don't pay no attention to what's happening at the elementary. Buy this high school. Like, we need to be thinking about this holistically. So we needed a what's next. So I think as we make those decisions, we have to take into consideration all those points you just made. But in that conversation, like, this is the direction we're going in, and we do need more revenue to afford to even do some of these changes.
Yes, and that's my next question. There were these projections of enrollment. Did they factor in the new constructions that, whenever they may or may not materialize in this town, are they included in those projections?
So the demographic study, enrollment study, does take into consideration, it at the time of the study, which was in September, they did take into consideration all pending projects. They did take into consideration the new zoning that was enacted through the MBTA communities. There's also, just in birth rate decline, these overarching predictions that even with all that housing, we aren't going to see. Now, I think those sorts of studies are easy to feel like, you don't believe it. But that was the study. We commissioned a third party to look at it for us. It does align with other state trends and what some other communities are seeing. So I think, let's say the enrollment study is completely botched and nothing, in 10 years from now, 20 years from now, enrollment's off the charts again. If we've made decisions to invest in our footprints and make our buildings, renovate them, it's better to add on to a renovated building than it is to just hold on to an old building for 20 years and then be like, oh, we're going to open it again because now we need students in it. So I think we have to try to balance the resources we have with as best as we can predict future enrollments to be. But it did take into consideration that, and the report is very lengthy and robust, so happy to share that. I believe that's on our webpage for this process if you want to dive into it.
And I have just one comment for you specifically, but also for the grader. I think the town needs more development. We can all hate as much as we want on Quincy, but they do have a good high school. They have new high schools. They have big schools. And yes, they have a lot of construction. But they also have the schools that basically we want. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
John Cass, resident with 2 kids, one who has left the high school and one in middle school. Thank you so much for tonight. I appreciate it. One question I had was, how much money would it cost for the town to maintain our backlog on a yearly basis? How we got here was because we haven't been maintaining our school buildings for 30 or 40 years, right? And I still don't know, and I still don't understand how much would actually cost to maintain our buildings compared to what we're paying at the moment. And my main concern is, if we do any of these options, and I think they're all reasonable options, if we do any of these options, will we going forward actually start to maintain the buildings at the rate that they should be so that we don't get into this problem again? So I think my major criticism of the presentation today is that it doesn't really address that issue. I mean, it kind of does in a way because you're solving some of the long-term problems, because you're reducing the overall costs. But I think that unless you show those numbers to the residents to explain to them how we got here and why we're digging a bigger hole every year, then it's really hard for them to understand why we need to make any decisions. And also the other issue is, say we have a really expensive elementary school, right, like Hollis or Highlands to maintain, right? It's costing us more and more every year to maintain. If we don't do something about it, it's actually going to cost us more in the end than it would if we did something. And actually, if we instead of investing in maintenance, and we got a debt, then what would happen is that our costs may actually go down and we get a new school at the same time. So what I'd like to ask you is, how are you going to show that to the residents? Because you're still not doing it. You're still not showing what the maintenance issue is. How are you going to show that to people?
I think that historically we haven't shown that. I think it's been further complicated by the fact that a couple years ago, you might remember, we took the school facilities away from the schools and put it on the town side as kind of a cost savings from the school's budget. We shifted about $5 million of school facilities custodian expenses from the school budget to the town budget. So it didn't really save us, it shifted that. But historically, we didn't invest, and the schools didn't invest enough on that upkeep of maintenance. So there wasn't, robust maintenance tracking programs at all the schools. When it shifted over to the town facility side, we had a lot more sort of hands-on resources to kind of step in and fix things, but we're still trying to catch up on how we track that, how we strategize that, how do we track work orders at schools. Right now, we're still kind of in that, fix what's broken, make sure the student experience isn't impacted, make sure teachers are comfortable. If a teacher has a heating issue, get facilities over there. As much as we want to be on top of tracking that, we're still trying to build out those systems and track that data. And I think it's a very good point to formulate that, sort of return on investment. We just don't have that formulated yet, but we have been talking with the team in anticipation of this question about how we might start to talk and present that at the school committee level to show what is the current operational expenses at each school, what are the work orders in the last year at the school, where are we not keeping up with preventative maintenance, what should we be doing on, say, an HVAC system. At East and South, the new middle schools, when those projects turned over to the town, we had kind of a complete inventory, a modern building management system as part of that. So we have that data, but we don't have that data for like Hollis or Highlands or Ross. So, we kind of have information, but in a lot of different forms that we need to put together in a comprehensive way so we can make good decisions about it. So we're working on it, but I agree that is like a valuable tool that we need to pull together as a community, but we're kind of starting from scratch a little bit on how the town facilities team can present that to both the community and the school committee as they make these decisions.
Why don't we create a plan to do that? And I'm not asking us to do it overnight, because I do know that it costs money to key in all of the data for the equipment. And as Mayor Joyce had just mentioned, we've got 2 buildings, Middle and East, and the reason for that was because we actually got some money to create some software and key it into the system. So we actually have those 2 systems maintained. So why don't we build a plan that we can publish in the next year or so that shows, in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, when we'll have all that data in?
I think it's definitely a cost consideration. Real big picture early on. I think I was talking to, I think it was the former facilities director, Mike McGurty, about what it could take. Could we put could we put Hollis, that's never been into one of these building management systems, into one? Like, what would that take to hire someone to go in and inventory and put all the systems? And it was, ballpark like $1 million to create that for Hollis. So not saying that wouldn't be a wise investment, but is that where we want to spend $1 million across each elementary school? And I don't even know if that would be the cost. I just think when you're, if you can't do it with your own resources, which I don't think we've ruled out, we might be able to do it with our own resources. When you hire out a consultant to do that, it's a very extensive and long effort, and I think it's something to consider in the future, but it could be quite costly. So something to consider.
And I agree with that, Mayor Joyce, but I also think that like Mike McGurty and Mike Esmond, they came out with a plan that's actually not very dissimilar to what was shown today. You did a great job of presenting it in a very nice way, and we have a wonderful website. It looks better than it did. But basically the numbers are pretty much the same. There's some more detail, like we have numbers between 90 and 135 million currently, and then in 5 years' time, we've got some additional numbers because the percentage goes up, and then in 10 years' time, we've got additional numbers, and that's all useful. But if we had, instead of spent a couple $100,000 on the consultant, we'd spent it on, and it was $100,000. If we spent it on having the maintenance department and Mike Esmond doing that work, right, keying everything in, we would have data to have. And so my question here is, the thing that I've always been agitating for is, how do we do this long term? How do we solve a long-term question? And we're doing this now, but 12 years ago, we did a similar report, right? I mean, I don't think it was as good, but we had a report, and that report set the strategy for basically Manadequate. And it set the strategy for the middle schools and all that. And we started implementing it, right? So what I would have liked to see with this report or going forward is a live system, right? So wouldn't it make more sense, instead of every 10 years we don't do everything, but we have the capacity internally, right, to be able to manage that? Wouldn't it make more sense to do that? Why don't we do that? Why don't we create the capacity so that we don't have to spend $400,000 every 10 years on that, but we've got the ability to get that data up on a yearly basis on a live system and help us make better decisions? Why don't we do that?
It's possible that we could have the capacity with internal teams to inventory buildings, put them into a system and use that. Our finance director, Mike Esmond, tackles this while also keeping us out of a hole and keeping us on a 5, so it's not really, I wouldn't put this on his responsibility per se. And I think too, on our facilities side, they do need more resources, and they do need, more staff to be able to help do this. And that might be exactly where we place, some of this, the effort moving forward as we think about the systems that we have, what we might need to build out, what is our own internal capacity to build it out. I think it will play into the conversation whether or not, we need to rely on a consultant or we can do it in-house. But we haven't had the in-house resources to date. So it's just identifying what those could be, what the system would want to be, and getting something in place.
So it was mentioned about budget issues, and it was said that we don't have the resources and we don't have the money, the revenue. Actually, we could do that, and we've done it in the past. Back in the 20th century and also in the 1890s, we spent more as a percentage of the value of our town on school budget and the town services than we did. So why don't we work on getting more revenue? Because that's the other critique that I have of the presentation tonight, which is, I mean, we talked a little bit about budget, so we talked a little bit about getting debts, but what about revenue? Have you thought about revenue, and are you going to show any revenue ideas, how we can get some additional revenue?
Yeah, I mean, revenue is a critical piece of this. A lot of our revenue restriction is because of a state law. Our towns, most of our revenue comes from our property taxes, commercial and residential, and the growth of that value every year is restricted to 2.5% growth. So it does really makes it hard to see significant amounts of new revenue when that's the majority of your revenue. Now, new growth, new investments in a given year add on top of that 2.5. So communities like Weymouth and Quincy have seen upwards of $2.5, $3 million of new growth a year in Weymouth, $7 million in Quincy. Braintree's been hovering right around, 800,000 year over year. So, there's big differences in the amount of money that's brought in during the new growth. So, that's more money. I think it's trying to frame the order of magnitude of revenue that's needed. Other ways for communities to get more revenue is through tax overrides or debt exclusions, voter approved, opportunities to collect more taxes from residents. Those are the main revenue side. Certainly state aid that we get, grants help bring in more resources. But when we talk about the amount of revenue that's needed, I think we should be careful to be realistic for how we might get there. And if we're talking about we want to have twice as much revenue as we have today, I don't know if we're going to get there, but I think that is part of the conversation. What is the level of revenue? And Mr. Cass, I'm happy to take more questions, but there's a couple people standing, so you can we can come back up after they have a chance. I appreciate that. Thank you, Councilor Moran.
Good evening. I'm Peter Moran. I'm the counselor for District 6, which includes Highland School and Liberty and South. I want to thank you for the work that you've done on this. I think that it informs the discussion. Particularly, it informs the discussion about our present circumstances. I speak as someone who, and my wife warned me not to sound like an old fart, but I went to Highlands, I went to South. My kids went to Highlands, went to South. I don't have kids in the system now, but my experience and my children's experience have informed me of the importance of the decisions that are being made on what we do with our elementary schools. And I think that, for various reasons, we have not invested enough in our elementary schools. We decided to go for the middle schools, which affected a larger pool of students, but postponed the investment that needs to be made into these schools. I think this plan informs where we are in the present. It does not inform and does not really contemplate the future well. I don't think it's intended to. I don't fault it for that. But I don't think that looking at where we are now and how we address the current circumstances anticipates well for the future. Right now we have stagnant real estate. People my age got good mortgage deals 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And if we want to downsize and move out and sell to a young couple that wants to bring their kids up and move into my neighborhood, we're going to be paying a higher interest rate. We're not going to move. We're not going to move until conditions change. But conditions will change. This happens. And when we do, if we reduce our footprint and how many places we have available for students just based on our current circumstances, we'll be back doing this again and spending more money. So we have to, I think what we have to have is some flexibility, and we have to have a town-wide referendum on the direction the town chooses to go. This is critical. This is a watershed moment. So rather than closing Highlands in the fall and next fall sending people up to Old South, which I'll get to in a minute, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to get to it. I think we need to have a full discussion about, do you want to retain neighborhood schools, or do you want to go to consolidated, bigger schools? I don't like bigger schools because I went to Braintree High School when there were 780 kids, okay? And I was lucky. I had a supportive family. I didn't have any learning disabilities. But I saw that everybody was trying to push to the middle, and if you were a little bit different or you had a struggle, or even if you excelled, you were pushed towards the middle, and we'll just get you through. And I just remember, yeah, I had 30 kids in my classes, but we had groups. We had 3 reading groups that broke out in those classrooms at Highlands. I know it's not ideal, but it was done. And just to get to, it sounds great on paper to just take Old South and move Highlands into it. But once again, you are putting every child attending elementary school in South Braintree within a quarter mile of each other, and then having the middle schoolers right behind them. Drive Peach Street, drive Liberty Street, drive Route 37 on rush hour if you haven't, and see how that's going to go for you. It's not going to work well. We haven't even started to address that, and I don't know if we can logistically. I don't know how that's going to work, the pickup and drop off. So I appreciate the work that's been done. I think that we need to put this before the entire town before we take any steps to allow everyone to make a choice. I guess we'd put 2 override questions on, and let because we're going to need an override either way, and let the town choose the direction with the most information that they can. I think neighborhood schools, I favor them because it gives the smaller schools give kids a chance to shine. A kid will get a chance to win a spelling bee in a smaller class than they will in a bigger one. They'll get to play, they might get to be in a play and have a lead part. They don't get lost in a neighborhood school. And I'm afraid of what we will lose, largely because we're trying to figure out what to do with an empty building that we frankly put money into when we were thinking about making it into a pre-K center that could have been put into Highlands and put it in a better situation than it is now, and revitalized it. So enough sour grapes for me, but I think that this needs to be a town-wide decision at a ballot box. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Hello.
Hi, I'm Kara Slattery. I have 2 kids at Flaherty, twins, so I can kind of gauge how the difference would be putting one of my kids into a large school versus a small, because they learn and develop very differently. So I wrote a soliloquy so I can focus. I will have a question at the end of it. But our educators and our school leaders have been doing the absolute best they can with far too little. The funding provided by the town of Braintree and the state has never matched the level of need, and yet they have stretched every dollar to keep the programs alive for our students. I've watched members of the school committee negotiate, advocate, and fight for every academic program, extracurricular activity, and athletic opportunity, and every improvement to our facilities. None of it has come easily, and none of it has come without a fight. And despite the challenges, we have incredible principals, teachers, and staff in our schools. I think we're kind of, when we talk about facilities, we forget sometimes to accentuate the people behind the product. But people who come to work every single day, not because the system makes it easy, but because they genuinely care about the children they serve. They show up for our students out of dedication, compassion, and belief in the importance of public education. But we cannot expect to keep the great educators if we continue to treat our school system as an afterthought. If we want to retain the talented professionals who make our schools strong, we must be treating the Braintree Public Schools as the nucleus of this community, which I think I've said every time I speak publicly. A successful town cannot be built on the backs of a handful of people trying to make the schools a priority while others look the other way. That responsibility belongs to the entire community. Strong schools are not optional. They are the foundation of a thriving town or city. If we want Braintree to remain a place where families want to live, where property values remain strong, where the community continues to grow, we must start acting like our schools matter. Because the truth is simple. When we invest in our schools, we invest in the future of the entire town. Our school system is decades behind physically and therefore academically, and pretending otherwise is a disservice to our students and our community. The schools desperately need modern facilities, science labs, computer classrooms, visual and performing arts spaces, music rooms, STEM labs, upgraded libraries, community gathering areas, and functional dining spaces. Gym and cafetoriums, I don't want to eat where I sweat. So these are not luxuries, they are baselines for modern education, yet facilities alone are not enough. A strong school system must also provide a robust catalog of academic opportunities that prepare students for the world they are entering, including the arts, music, theater, advanced computer science programs, a full range of AP courses, and strong athletic programs that give students opportunities to grow, compete, and lead. These programs are not extras. They are essential parts of the well-rounded education and critical to keeping students engaged, inspired, and prepared for colleges and careers. Yet while other districts, even those in lower-income cities, have invested in both their facilities and academic offerings, we have allowed years of neglect to pile up. So let's be honest, you cannot build a 21st century education on a cracked and crumbling foundation. For most of our buildings, cosmetic upgrades would be nothing more than a Band-Aid. Aside from East and South, nearly every school is suffering from decades of financial neglect and deferred maintenance. That neglect didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. The era of political games, complacency, and backroom favoritism needs to end. Our school system must be treated with seriousness it deserves. Our children must be treated with the seriousness they deserve. Our community's future depends on it. That means facing the reality of funding. So if it means pursuing another override, even if it's unpopular with those who refuse to acknowledge the problem. One override in the entire history of Braintree is not a sign of fiscal discipline. It's a sign that we have avoided the investments necessary to keep our community strong. Strong communities invest in their schools. High-quality school systems are what make towns desirable, stabilize commercial investments, strengthen property values, and attract families who want to put down roots. It starts with the schools. We need a comprehensive rehabilitation of our school infrastructure and a commitment to maintaining strong academic, artistic, athletic programs that give every student the opportunity to succeed. And we need the leadership willing to fight for the funding required to make it happen. Not someday, not when it's convenient, but we need it now. So, the funding down the road is great to look at, but, what are we doing now? We're making a decision. We need to take the action. Find the funding, demand it, because our future of this town and the future of our children depends on it. So I guess after that, thanks. We did the override. We did one. I know it wasn't pleasant, but if we're going to be talking about a debt exclusion that focuses solely on the facilities, the buildings, the infrastructure, what happens when we need to put something inside of it? How do we fund that? And where's that, so that's the kids. And so when are we going to talk about that? Because that has to run in parallel with this conversation. We can't just say, we're going to build the great schools. And if we build great schools and great people want to come here, will this not someday maybe change our enrollment? Are we looking at this in a silo a little bit?
So thank you very much. We're trying really hard not to look at this in a silo, but it is there's a lot of moving pieces. So we're trying to keep in our framework that this is operationally what we're looking at for the schools. This is what goes inside of the school buildings. These are there really aren't any capital expenses in this. So this is how we afford the programs in the schools. And you can see the blue line is the revenue. that we are projecting out through fiscal year 29. And the red line is the expenses. It's hard for me to see from this angle. And the dotted red line is expense projections if the schools keep growing at what they've shown and demonstrated that they need to be growing at. So they need resources to allow their budget to grow 4% year over year. The town does not have revenue, as even with the override, to fund that growth. So every year the schools are going to say, we need to grow at 4%. The town's going to say, we really can only afford for you to grow at 3.5%, and you're going to start to see that operational gap develop every year. So we need to be strategizing for that and how we're going to fund that. And decisions to close the gap every year, we need to be very careful not to make them with one-time resources like we had historically been doing when we used ARPA money, ESSER funds, free cash, circuit breaker resources, something that's not predictably reoccurring. It helps close the gap in that year, but then the next year, you're still growing that gap 0.5% more than you can afford. So it catches back up with you. So we're being really careful to think about when we close the gap with non-reoccurring revenue, how is that going to play out in the years ahead? So we're trying really hard to track that, and we're tracking that not only on the school side, but the town side as well. And it's very likely that, as we look at what we want to afford, where we want to be from a community, and as costs increase and as we continue to be constricted with Prop 2.5, and if new growth doesn't come into the community and we don't see that boost on the revenue side, we will see the gap grow, and we will be back into a situation where we might need another override to close that gap. And communities all around us are having that conversation. I think today Brookline's going for an $18 million override, I think I read. So it's not, I think the state funding has certainly changed to be less to communities. I don't think that's changing anytime soon. We do need to take care of ourselves, and I think we're really trying hard to show how we're taking care of ourselves. I think one of the questions were, rooting this effort in making sure that the experience for our students is what we're really focused on. And part of this work was identifying an educational adequacy score of all of our schools. I think the slide that it pops up on is one with like red, yellow, green. I'm going to try to get to it without taking too much time. It talks about the educational EA scores. And you can see, okay, they're on all of the elementary schools. So this is out of 100%. When you think about the condition of some of the buildings, and then you see what we're doing, I mean, the educational adequacy scores are not that bad, all things considered. The wind is crazy. And I think that really speaks to what our educators and what the district has done to make sure that when a kindergartner walks into their classroom, it is as awesome and as welcoming and as functional as they can make it be. And they are scoring really well. Now, we know that that score doesn't really line up with, when you look in the empty closet or you go into the boiler room, but the student experience is really something that the district has thrived to keep high with the conditions of the building. We just don't want that to become something that stops being as effective. And we are asking a lot of our educators to keep making do in rooms that we would love to be able to invest in and modernize. So I think when we look at how we're doing now, how we want to do better, where we want to strategize investments, how we might be able to afford it, we want to make sure that all those decisions aren't made sort of in silos, because we don't want to say, go to the voters for a debt exclusion for a new high school, and then the community comes out to support that, and then next year, maybe we need an override to afford the programs. Like, we need to be strategic about when we talk about what extra revenue we need and when we need to ask that of the voters. And we need to make sure that the decision for the capital is made with the same, in the same realm of making sure that we can afford the programs and what we want to be in the buildings that we're keeping and what we're investing in.
Yeah. So my only concern is that if we hold out for too long, and again, we'll be looking at another $18 million. Why not do smaller increments like other towns have done with their overrides and their debt exclusion, mostly overrides, that's what I focus on, but smaller increments more often than waiting until the 911 moment and saying, oh my God, we need $18 million, and then having the entire town implode. So like, that's, if we take care of things, maintain, we don't have to revamp. So,
Great, thank you. Yes?
Hi everyone, my name is Roger Lee. I'm a proud parent of 2 boys, and I'm here to represent Morrison. Woo. It's very funny that everybody's talking about deferred maintenance and the door keeps opening. So I kind of want to touch a little bit on something else, not as much as on the maintenance. So we addressed the maintenance backlog, right? Like you're basically admitting that this has happened. Your chart's telling us that. And you've come up with many scenarios that kind of cover what we can and can't do. So moving to a centralized early and upper elementary system is a massive shift from our families. How will your districts ensure that these isn't just a short-term fix, but a 50-year life cycle replacement that isn't a Band-Aid, that justifies the transition? And specifically, has the town explored creative non-tax revenue, like energy enterprise funds for solar or public-private partnerships to help fund these modernizations so that the burden doesn't fall entirely on the people here that pay the taxes? I'm just looking for a plan that outlasts my kids' time at the schools. My 5-year-old is great at a lot of things, but I prefer he doesn't add structural engineer to it while he's in class.
Thanks for that question. I agree. I want our decisions to, the decisions we make now to be beneficial for generations to come. That's why we're doing this work. I don't expect, I have kids in high school, East and Hollis, and I expect this work, to maybe not even be something that will benefit them, but hopefully for generations to come. And it's going to take some time. So I think as far as identifying other potential revenue sources for projects, we touched on the MSBA partnership. Now that could be for a new building. We haven't in the past done accelerated repair projects with them in collaboration for smaller projects. So I think there's opportunities, depending on the project, whether it's like an energy project, efficiency project, that could have grant opportunities that we could explore. We haven't generated a realistic list of that yet, but I think that is, has to be a big part of the conversation moving forward. But we haven't honed in on any of them other than to, talk really big picture about something like a public-private partnership to build a school. I think there's communities in other states that have done that successfully. So trying to think outside the box about that is somewhere I think we need to be, but I don't really have anything like, I couldn't pull up a list to say we've considered these as being, possible or not possible. I think that conversation still has a long way to go.
Can I also make an additional statement? I really, really do appreciate that you guys give the community a voice, give us a chance to kind of talk and digest everything, because you're throwing a lot of information out there, and I really do appreciate it. So keep doing the community stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, come on up.
So when the override just got brought up, you said that there's $50 million that we need for deferred maintenance to keep the schools that we currently have renewed to whatever level that we expect them to be, $50 million that we need theoretically towards a high school if we get brought to the top of the list. The timeline had something about closing one of the schools for this upcoming school year, so like we wouldn't know if we were getting the high school money. So if you were to put a $50 million override up to the town right now, maybe it's broken up if we're going to keep all 6 elementary schools or we're going to do 4 or 5. How does that measure compared to the override that we just passed? Like as far
like
as
a cost
size?
to like a cost to an individual taxpayer or order of magnitude?
And I understand that interest rates are way different, but like, is it 3 times as much money that we're asking of the community? Is it half as much? And this is really important for the school board, because whatever they decide to put forward, we got to put something together that we actually think the town's going to go for.
Yeah, and
and
I
money
think
matters.
when we talked about, I'm going to get close to the end, the timeline. I'm going to go to the timeline step. So on the top here, we have begin planning for debt exclusion votes to support high priority projects. So I think as early as, this late summer into the fall, we might start putting formwork around, if we were to say, embark on a vote. I think Councilor Moran had suggested maybe a townwide referendum or some vote. Do we want to go to the town with a ballot question that asks what direction to take, or do we want to take it one step further and say, do you want to take this direction and, debt exclude some amount of money? I think it's, do people want to make the decision when there's no money involved? And then when the decision to spend the money, you're going to be making your decisions, you're going to have to have a backup plan. So I think trying to keep in mind what it could look like, what could be the cost, how you track it against potential future overrides, other debt exclusions. If we were to do, we did talk real big picture about whether or not you would do a debt exclusion for repairs at the elementary schools alongside, say, a debt exclusion for a new high school, depending on the timing of that. Of course, we would have to have a formulated plan on how to spend the $50 million. If we were to say have $50 million to spend on elementary schools tomorrow, it would be hard for us to identify projects, get the projects procured, completed. So there's sort of a resource buildup and time in which, even if we had the money, we have to strategically spend it. So that's kind of the work that I think is going to go on as we talk about begin planning for, some future vote of the community to base, to get some buy-in on what direction we head.
And roughly, how does it compare to the last override?
I can't recall what the average taxpayer increase. Director Esmond, do you recall what for the $8 million override? So that was adding $8 million a year to our operational budget. So that's like an every year increase. Debt exclusions have a timeline and they're for a specific amount. So it's a little bit different, but we could give order of magnitude for what that could look like to a taxpayer as the school committee starts to vet some of these options.
Thank you.
Yep. Hi, Counselor.
Hi. Elizabeth Maglio. I am the town councilor from East Braintree, District 3. Thank you very much for being here, for putting all of this work in, for giving us and giving the town the opportunity to weigh in. I don't know how many more opportunities there are going to be, so I'm grabbing tonight to just make a couple of comments that may be premature, but I just want to get them on the record. So I guess one reaction I had to the enrollment part of the criteria is that enrollment is something that is so based on in the moment. Enrollment is a snapshot, and it would be, I think that using that as part of the criteria doesn't make a whole lot of, it's not that intuitive to me. What would be more intuitive would be capacity. Because if a building is full, it's full. If it's not full, it can be full. So capacity, I think, for enrollment would be better than enrollment. The second two suggestions that I have really have to do with the money. And obviously, that's where all of the focus needs to be. When we're making decisions about educational quality, then we also need to figure out how are we going to afford that. And I heard the suggestion about bringing this to a vote before the town. I think it's a great idea. In order to vote for it, though, that's where we'd need to have two more pieces of information. All of the financials. What are the offsets for a school that's closed versus opened? What are we saving? What are we gaining? What does that cost? And then the economic development plan. And I know that wasn't part of this piece of work, but it has to be. Without a future economic development plan, without a bean counter actually telling us what's going to happen within the what we already know, I don't see how people can actually make a choice. So what I would ask is maybe some input from the town's economic development director that just started, some looking at some comparative analysis, looking at some case studies from other comparative towns in terms of how these decisions, the climate of real estate development, open space, all of those issues. We can't have more foster schools that sit there and have leaks and mold and just sit there as a blight in the community. We have to look at how we can repurpose these buildings. And I don't know how we make a vote as to whether we close one or another without having that part of the vision for what we really want things to look like. So those would be my pitch for additional info before bringing this to the voters, or as part of bringing this to the voters. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
First, thanks for doing this presentation. It's given me a lot better of an idea of what we're looking at. I really appreciate that. It seems like you've put a lot of time and effort into this. The one thing I would love to see, and I think it would help for all voters, is just more detail of what exactly these are. I'm just a very visual person, so seeing like what those like updates to the classroom, what the education would be like. Like I understand that the sinks when I went to high school and the laboratories are still broken, but like what exactly would those updates look like? And I do have a focus question. It's a very almost legendary thing in the town, and I think it would draw a lot of people here if we had more insight on it, is if the school would ever get a pool or a skating rink. And is that something within the scope of the project?
So I think, we do, separate from the school sort of building, especially at the high school, we need to have a community conversation around athletic facilities at the high school. I think, years ago, there was contemplation of putting a multi-sport facility, a title not to be named, next to the high school. So I think that is a part of a bigger conversation that we need to have, especially as we look at, if we do renovate or build a new high school. I think we should make sure we include in that conversation the ability to afford. I mean, we do need to update our turf and track. That is, an investment we need to make, very soon. Are there other facilities that we would like to have for our students, whether it's a pool or, another turf or additional, rinks, whatever it ends up being. So I think that has to be part of some of the feasibility planning when we do talk about what we would do at the high school. And I think that should also, and will need to also play into the capital plan. Right now in our 5-year capital plan, we haven't been able to afford the investments in our recreational spaces that we want to. My, $35 million 5-year plan doesn't include much of money towards a new fire station, and we know we need upgrades there. So when we're trying to, pick away at what is a really big backlog of, amenities that we want to improve, there's a lot we need to talk about. So I think as we talk about the future of the high school, we need to also take into account, the whole site with the facilities and what we want to see there and how we might afford and put that into the capital plan as well.
Thank you. One follow-up question. With the feasibility, I'm just not understanding the timeline there. So like when would I be able to look out for that?
So the feasibility study is what is required by the MSBA as the next step. So you submit your statement of interest. If the MSBA reviews your statement of interest and decides to partner with you, to enter into a partnership with you, they require you to do a feasibility study that matches their requirements as early, onboarding of a project. So the feasibility study will be, what are we going to do with the high school, whether it's a renovation or a new build and that. So that would be, the soonest that could happen is probably early next year if we're accepted into the MSBA process for a new high school. The earliest we would look to be starting that, where you might hear more about that work happening, would be next January, February.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? What was that? Oh. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really cool opportunities that we can explore. I think this is really, the town isn't, forgetting about the work ahead. We're strategizing for the years to come. I think we have a lot of options and a lot of really cool things that, hopefully in the months ahead we can talk about with each other and at school committee. I think feeling like there's a perfect option out there is probably not how anybody feels. But I do hope that the community can see some excitement in the years to come based on the decisions that we'll be making. And yeah, I'm really excited for feedback. This is I think an important visioning effort for us to take, and it also gives a lot of direction in the years to come for leaders who will be sitting in school committee seats and town council seats and in the mayor's office, and really trying to hone in on the direction the community wants to go in. We are here to serve you guys, not tell you what we think you should do. And there's a lot of information out there. I hope tonight's presentation gives it to you in a format that you haven't seen before and helps you kind of understand the magnitude of what we're trying to tackle. And I just want to thank you all for spending a good while here tonight, and hopefully continue this conversation as you head home tonight. So please, if you have questions that weren't answered, or you think of something, you can feel free to email the school committee, mayor's office. Like I said, this conversation is going to continue at the school committee in the months ahead. So thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you. Oh, we do have to, yep, this will be posted on the facilities website, but we can also get it out probably through Parent Square. I also do have to turn this over to both the school committee chair and school building committee chair to adjourn their meetings. So thank you.
All right, so I need a motion and a second to adjourn the school committee meeting. We have a motion and a second. I need a roll call vote. So Member Kersberg, Member Donahoe, Member Tuffy, Member Horak, Member Fogarty, Mayor Joyce. Chair votes aye. We are adjourned.
And before I adjourn the school building committee, I just want to thank you, Mayor Joyce, to you and your team, and to Superintendent McDonald, to you and your team. The schools are not in the best condition, we all know that, but our schools are exceptional, the education is exceptional. A house in Braintree that's maintained the best does not make it the best home, it's what's inside that counts. It's our teachers, our staff who work hard every day, it's the curriculum, it's the pride and the knowledge, and this is what makes our Braintree Public School systems amazing, and this is why we are exceptional. Is there a motion to adjourn the school building committee? Motion made by Superintendent McDonald, seconded by Director Esmonds. Thank you all.